Welcome to week 3. This is your intro video to get you set up for this week. Also segue a little bit from what we have done this past week. Let me just start out by thanking you for the rich conversation that I think we've been able to get started this past week. I think there have been some good searching questions. I think some constructive criticism of secondary writers, of Paul himself, of my interpretation, and I think that's what makes for a good engagement with the text as we attempt to discern what it means together. And we really do depend on the experiences, the lives, the voices, the minds of one another, I think, to interpret this letter well. Looking ahead to what is coming this week, we are going to be dealing with not a terribly long segment of the argument, but an especially dense part of it, especially the second part of what we're going to study, which is 3:21 to 31. And as we do, it's going to be important to remember what I think we're all showing some appreciation for, some acquaintance with in the way that we're studying, and that is taking into account the rhetorical purpose and dynamics and tone of what Paul is up to, as opposed to reading Paul's letter as if he were writing an encyclopedia article or some general treatise about something. This is a living pastoral voice engaged with real life issues and also engaged in a subtle sort of rhetorical challenge to communicate not just the content of the gospel, but you might say its tone as well, its peculiar force in view of what the churches in Rome are navigating in their time. This leads me to take up a question that's come up from several of you that I think is a helpful one to get on the table for everybody, and that is, does our attention to the particulars of Paul's argument somehow minimize the force that Paul's argument has for other contexts beyond the one that he's addressing the most immediately, when he's talking, as he did in our passage for last week, about epic sins in Israel's and Gentile people's pasts? Does the way he talks about those injustices, that wickedness, have implications for how we talk about similar injustices in our time? And yes, I just want to say unequivocally that Paul's letter has a kind of resonance, a power of reverberation that reaches beyond the immediate context that he's addressing, in part, I think, by his own intention, but he's certainly writing a letter that has come to have an impact far beyond what he could have anticipated, and yet it does have that impact. And I think it's because Paul is treating something that has reach to deal with any reader, any community of readers that is touched by this letter and finds itself reading it as we do in this class. The key, though, as I've said in a few of my responses this past week, is not to engage in a kind of sloppy generalization or a very casual way of extrapolating what Paul is saying. And this is often, I think, what Christian theology has done, especially in academic settings, but also from the pulpit and in other contexts. We're apt to regard the Scripture as just this kind of generic source book that gives us some general ideas to be kind of applied willy-nilly in any context that we deem it appropriate. And that, I think, is not the right kind of generalizability of Romans. Instead, we want the way that we extend the meaning of these words with our own voices, our own lives, to be consonant with the tone and rhetorical particulars that characterize the words in Romans itself. So, yes, a wide reach, but a reach that if it's going to be sound, if it's going to resonate with the music of this letter, it's going to reflect its particulars in the way that it sort of spreads. And this is something I've actually enlisted Toni Morrison to help articulate with a quotation of hers that you'll find at the beginning of Response Forum 2 for this week, and I hope will be cause for some additional reflection for all of us. But just maybe to illustrate one example of what I'm saying, and this also came up in several groups in a way that I think was very constructive. Paul is denouncing certain kinds of sin in these epic pasts of Israel and Gentile peoples. As I've said, there are certain sexual kinds of sin that he highlights, and I think that the texts, the memories that Paul is evoking in this context lead us, I think, to interpret those denunciations of that kind of sexual wickedness and its associations with idolatry carefully. Those texts have often been sort of neatly lifted from Romans as if they gave some kind of easy condemnation of every conceivable same-sex relationship or practice. And I think that that is not doing justice to Paul's words. Now, do Paul's words have implications, exert some kind of pressure on our understanding of what sexual health is, of what sexuality should be encouraged, of what kinds of sexual practices we might want to discourage? I think it does have implications for that. But the implications require pastoral care and sensibility. For one, we should be mindful that Paul is giving them in a context whose rhetorical purpose, as he makes explicit in chapter 2, verse 1, is, "So who are you, O human being, to judge?" So to use those very passages to then engage in a kind of self-righteous judgmentalism against some supposedly notorious sexual sins of our time, as supposedly what is symbolic of everything that is wrong with the world, is, I think, not consonant with what Paul is doing. So hopefully you're getting what I'm after here. We're after a kind of tension where the particulars of the text are not sort of restricting us so that we can only talk about one immediate context that Paul is addressing, but the particulars are affecting the sort of sensibilities that characterize our use of Paul's teaching, the way that we see it alive in our time, in our lives. And that's going to continue to be true of the segment of the letter that we have before us for this week. I want to point out a new challenge, you might say, that's going to come up. You're going to see this especially in Response Forum 1 this week, but it is that what Paul has done a little bit more subtly to this point, he's going to do now more overtly, and that is to enlist a dialogue partner as a kind of rhetorical device. He's going to begin to make an argument, to sort of engage in a sequence of reasoning about something, and then he is going to introduce into the text a rhetorical question as if posed by a dialogue partner. And so the force of the argument then depends on our ability to track with this back and forth, and therefore the ability to distinguish between Paul's voice and the voice that Paul is giving to a dialogue partner. So you'll see that I attempt to make this clear in the podcast exposition of the segment for this week, but I just want you to be aware that that's going to be a challenge for you as you're interpreting the text of Romans this week, and you can sort of judge whether you think commentators and secondary writers have done justice to the rhetorical subtlety of that device of a dialogue partner. One other thing to mention that has also come up and that I think is going to continue to be present in our discussions, you'll notice that there are certain terms of interpretation of analysis that I use as a way of making sense of the text that might seem to you to be a little bit arbitrary. One of those is the phrase table of blessing, table of gathering. And I want to explain that my rationale for that is of course complex, but most immediately it is that the argument of Romans is actually headed in a direction that is going to land at the dynamics of community, the dynamics of power, especially as these are expressed in the sharing of the community around the table and the way that that sort of sharing becomes the pattern for a wider sharing of power, sharing of economic goods of the communities that Paul is writing to. So this table of blessing kind of concept that I am using is not just something that I think is interesting. I do think that it's theologically rich as an image and has all kinds of connections with key commitments that we have, key practices of Christian community, but most directly I use it because it is coming later in Romans, where the language that we're currently interpreting, language of judgment, for example, language of boasting this week that is intimately related to judgment, is going to come directly back into the letter, so that we'll see at that point sort of what Paul was getting at already in this earlier stage of the letter. When Paul comes to the question in the middle of this difficult passage we have coming up, chapter 3, verse 27, where then is boasting? I hope that you are struck by the rhetorical force of that question. It assumes that what Paul has been addressing in the previous paragraph, if not the whole preceding part of the argument leading back to the thesis, is this issue of boasting, which I think has a lot of overlap semantically with the issue of judgment as a kind of hypocritical, self-righteous rule over others. So hopefully you're beginning to see that when Paul asks a question, where then is, what then about, that makes explicit what was implicit in the preceding part of the argument that we then have to use to interpret that preceding part of the argument. All in all, as we get into some meaty passages this week, I hope that as you're thinking about the wider relevance of Paul's teaching, you will see that it is not enough for us just to sort of get the ideas right. The rhetorical art of Paul's letter is itself part of what it means. There is a tone to this letter. It's not just what it means, it's how it means, it's how it sounds, it's the kind of music or poetic quality that characterizes it that we have to interpret. This is so important because the meaning of Romans is affected by who is speaking its meaning, what their social location is, what sort of privilege or lack of privilege has characterized their lives based on where they sit in the social fabric. These are not matters that are secondary or marginal. They're actually integral to how this text means or sounds the way that it does. And it's the rhetorical particulars of Paul, the pastoral concerns that they reflect, that enable us to see that interpreting the letter is not just a matter of getting the ideas right, it's tone of voice. It's knowing from where you're speaking, when. It's not just knowing what to say, you as the interpreter of the letter, as the one who is using its teaching. It's knowing how to say it, when to say it, to whom to say it, when you shouldn't say a damn thing. Sometimes that's the right interpretation of Romans, to say nothing. So hopefully we'll be mindful of these particulars in the way that we spread the teaching of this great letter.